So in our previous lesson, we were able to take our text and format it, and we also have it in a nice spot to where it is tracking along, and so it looks like it is actually floating out there in the water. But what would be really great is if we had a nice reflection that mimicked the reflection for these other objects over here. So if we zoom in a little bit into our footage, you can see that the reflection for these buildings are a little distorted. You can see that they're kind of blurred and elongated, and then we also have this texture that the water is creating for on top of that reflection. So, you know, what we really have here is a rectangle, or actually like a column of a square column, and then you look down on the reflection and it's very distorted. So we're going to go ahead and create that same reflection for our type. Let's grab our type layer and let's duplicate it. So you can come over to Edit and we'll duplicate. So you can also hit Control D to duplicate that layer. And then let's go ahead and name this layer so that we don't confuse it with the other text layer. We'll just call it our reflection. So you can just click on that layer and hit Enter on your keyboard to rename it. And so now that we have that layer duplicated, let's right click on it and we want to transform, and then we're going to flip it vertically, so up and down. And that will actually take that type, and it is now mirroring itself, but it's still kind of lined up. So look, what we want to do though is we want to take that and we want to just push it down, so you can grab that Y handle, and just when it has lined up with the bottom of the other layer, then we're actually going to take the Z handle. So we're going to be pushing it back in Z space so that it is now lined up with that same text layer. And that is because the X and the Y are in relationship to the world. So that is, we're using the world axis mode. And so the true X and Y is not necessarily in relationship to that layer. So if we had in relationship to that layer, we could have just taken it and just pushed it straight down. And so we also have the view axis mode. So this is how the camera is facing, or how we're viewing. And so just depending on which view mode you have, then you might need to make an adjustment after we move this layer down. So now that we have that layer adjusted below the other layer, then let's go ahead and we're going to create a blur, and we're going to create a directional blur. So you can type in DIR and then it'll pull up directional blur under effects and presets. And if you don't have this window open, you can come over to Window and you can take a look at your effects and presets, or hit Control+5. So with that reflections layer selected, let's double click on our directional blur, and you can look over in your effect controls, and the default is for it to be 0. And we do want this direction to kind of line up with the rest here. So you can see that we're kind of at an angle. So maybe we need to actually adjust that angle a little bit to the left, so at -7. And we're going to just click and drag. And we're just going to adjust that blur length. So maybe we need to adjust it to about 54. Maybe a little bit too much angle here. So about -3, and we have our blur length set to 54. So it already looks like the layer is like a distorted reflection, but we don't have that awesome texture that we have on the water. And in order to create that, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to grab our footage. We're going to duplicate, so we can Control D. So with that layer duplicated, let's go ahead and name this one. We're going to hit Enter on our keyboard, and we're going to call that Ripple. And we also want to, we can go ahead and delete that camera tracker for this layer, because we don't need it for this footage layer. And we're going to take that layer, and we're going to come over and we're going to type in brightness and contrast, because we want to really bring up some of the ripple in this water. And if it helps you to be able to see, we can temporarily turn off the view for these other layers, or you can click this little button right here, or actually next to the ripple, and that will isolate just that layer. And so that's in this column right here. And so now let's go ahead and adjust our brightness and contrast. So let's come over and type in brightness, double click on that. Let's come over to our brightness, and we're going to just really bring up the brightness a lot because we want to be able to see a lot of detail. And for our contrast though, instead of coming and adding contrast, we're actually going to go a little bit into the negative, maybe about negative 30 or so. So maybe just below the maximum. So maybe we'll do about 147 or so for our contrast. We'll just kind of take a look at our footage, make sure that we have a lot of contrast going on, because we want to just take that texture and that will actually be showing up, and just we're going to use it as a track map. And so it's just going to be allowing what is nice and bright to kind of show through for our reflection. So now that we have our brightness and contrast, then let's also go and add a threshold effect. So we'll type in threshold, and we're going to use the CC threshold. And so here's where we have where we're able to see that ripple. So what we want to do is we're going to go to the very end of our timeline here, and let's go ahead and unisolate the layer so that we can also see exactly where this reflection is going to be. And what we want is we want that threshold to be in a spot where we have a lot of variation. So you can see that we have all that nice rippling going on. So maybe we should put this for that layer. We'll have it at about 76.5. But the thing is that we need to actually keyframe it. So I'm going to click on the stopwatch to add a keyframe, and we're going to just move back in our timeline, and you can see that now we don't have that variation anymore. So let's go ahead and we'll bring that back, and then we'll come through our timeline again. We can zoom out. We need to adjust to add some more ripple. Let's back up and again adjust for the ripple. And then just as our footage has left our view, we'll adjust one more time. It's about like that. And that is good. Okay, so now we have keyframed our threshold. But one thing that we do need to do to this threshold layer, to this layer that we've added the threshold to, is we need to smooth out this threshold. So we need to add an effect to the ripple itself. And so this will actually blur both of these effects because of the stacking order. So let's go ahead and we'll just add a Gaussian blur. So you can type in GAU and pull up the Gaussian blur and just double click on that. And we're just going to add a few pixels really of blur, just enough to kind of smooth out, to just take the edge off. So maybe right at about 1.1 pixels is what I have. And we're going to take that layer in the layers column. We're just going to drag it up to the top. And then since it is above the reflections, the ripple is above the reflections layer, come down to the track map. And we want to, instead of alpha, because this layer is black and white, it doesn't actually have any alpha, we're going to choose Luma Matte. And so now really the only thing that is showing up are the highlights of this layer, of this ripple layer. So now you can see when we back up into our footage that we have the water is actually creating the rippling that is going through this layer. But one thing that will really help us out is if we take this layer, this reflections layer, and we'll just bring the opacity down a little bit. So hit T on the keyboard. As you can see that this doesn't have the same value as these as the rest, or as there's the true image here. So let's go ahead and bring that value down. So we have it at about 24%. So now that really looks believable. So now when we just come through our timeline, you can see that we have the actual, if you look, you can even zoom in a little bit, and it very closely matches the surface that we have for the rest of these true reflections over here. So now that we have an awesome reflection going on, In our next lesson, we'll go ahead and animate our text dipping into the water.